So here's the thing about being rooted somewhere else. Can you really ever belong anywhere? I find that in both places, there's a sense of like, I don't fully belong.
I can tell you, in the school in Switzerland, I have absolutely no involvement. Everything is done by the kids, and the parents are really not involved in projects, and I just find that so
Liberating.
Yes. And good for the children.
I mean, the first thing I thought about was telling someone to just mind their own business, but I don't think I ever would.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast, a conversation between two relationship therapists who talk about real-life issues based on what they learn in a clinical setting, working with clients, and from their own experiences of motherhood, marriage, and parenting.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast.
Hello.
I am Dr. Olivia, and this is Elsa with me. Today, we will be talking about parenting across cultures. And we came up with this topic because it's an important one. For one, that because we are both from different cultures, we grew up in different countries, but we are living in America and raising our children here. And for me, this topic has become important because I've been living in my country of origin for the last year and a half now. For the first time raising my children there. Before that, I was in America. And so certain things have popped up for me. You know, it's been almost like reliving my own childhood, because I actually grew up in Switzerland and went to school there and didn't come to America until I went to college. And so I'm sort of reliving, my own childhood in many ways. And
through the lens of a mother this time.
Through the lens of a mother. Yeah, it's been eye-opening and wonderful and, challenging too, I would say. So
yeah, that's so interesting. I left my country in 2006, Venezuela, and I'm close to living half of my life in the US and half my life in Venezuela. And it's interesting to now have my children essentially not be from my country. That has presented its challenges. And I think this is something that really becomes important when you're raising children. Also, I feel like it's a topic that is so relevant in my practice and with clients because we live in Miami. And this is about as multicultural as it gets, at least, right now. So
yeah, my experience, you're right. I have so many clients that come from different cultures, and I always find it interesting, how do they raise their children? What are the cultural parts that they bring into parenting? And I find that differs among couples. And I think one thing I've noticed is if couples come from the same country and culture, the language is much easier if both parents speak the language to their children, because it becomes the dominant language in the home, or it can become. But I've equally seen, where that's not the case at all, where parents don't speak the language from their country, and they speak English in the home, and it's not important. And I find that fascinating. Like, how do parents negotiate that or find that balance or decide what they're going to do? It's
and it's sometimes even, I don't know if more complex, but it's interesting because so me and my husband are both from Venezuela, same country, same language. And for us, it's very important for our children to speak Spanish. And we speak Spanish to them, but sometimes we find them speaking English to us. So, there's what I've come to understand is that there's only so much you can do because, again, your children are being raised in a different country. I've learned that my kids are comfortable speaking Spanish to each other and to us for daily things and tasks, but they've learned to socialize in English. So when they are playing, even between sisters, they're playing in English. And it makes sense, right? You're being brought up in the US and you are living a social life in the US, and you do it in English.
Well, and I think it shifts when they go to school. I think that's when English takes over, and I think it really is it's about the parents enforcing it. Like if you enforce, and I learned that lesson with my own children, which I still think about to this day. I have a challenge. My husband doesn't speak German. I'm from Switzerland. I speak Swiss German and German. And, in Miami, even though there are, a good number of German people and Swiss, it's still relatively small. So
Yes.
I'm very, alone in this mission to, teach my children Swiss German and German, which to me is very important.
Mhm.
It's always been very important that my children have, the Swiss passport, that they know the culture, that they travel there, that they get to know what it's like to live there, to know their roots has
Mhm.
been important. But it's been a real challenge, raising them in a home where I'm married to an American who only speaks English, and I'm the only one speaking the language. And from the start, my children always spoke English back to me. And I remember meeting a linguist.
Okay.
She was from France, and she told me, she was like, there's only one way to do it, and that is you do not speak or answer to your child in any other language than the language you are teaching them. And I really do believe she's right, but it's not easy. And I
It's
find
not
it
easy.
super challenging.
I've caught myself talking to my children in English, and I'm like, what is going on with you? But it's easy to get caught up in that. Um, I wonder what it is. Sometimes I feel like maybe they understand me better, or when I'm talking to them about complex issues or about their emotions, I find myself going to English, which is
Yeah,
interesting because they would be
it's,
able to understand me in Spanish.
yeah. But the more complex, like the older my children are, the more complex the discussions are. And
Yes.
I can't explain certain things in German because their
Yes.
German isn't that advanced. And then
Mhm.
you're around a dinner table with your family, you're going to speak English,
And your
It's,
husband's there too. So here's my
yes.
question for you. Do you sense a competition or tension around there being like a predominant culture? Or have you seen that with clients that come from different countries?
No, I think it really is an individual preference, I would say, at least what I've seen.
Hmm.
But, I also know a client who comes from a different country. The spouse is American, and she was able to accomplish, that her child speaks only in the language that she raised the child in. And to me, I believe it really has to do with the parent and
Yes.
how the parent enforces that, how important it is for them to raise their children and go back to the country, be
Hmm.
connected to family members who speak that language.
Yes.
I find it's possible, but I think it's led by the parent. And
Absolutely. And I think, there's an element that if you are attached enough to your country and you make your culture interesting enough that it calls your child's attention, eventually they'll want to know about it and be a part of it. I remember my oldest, once when she was like 5, she said, where are you from? We're talking about Venezuela. And she goes, I'm not from Venezuela, I'm American. And I was like, my immediate response was like, no, you're not. But she really is. By the way, I am also American, but
yeah.
in my heart and my culture feels very much Venezuelan. And so she tells me like I'm American, and I said, I guess you kind of are. And what has been interesting, it didn't sit right with me. Not for any reason other than I think that she was not identifying with my Venezuelan
Right.
culture at all. But now that she's older, she's interested in it and she has
Yeah.
friends there. And we've been able to visit the past couple of years. They know the language with like colloquial phrases, not just
Uh-huh.
Spanish, but because
But
there's
your children have a different experience because they didn't grow up there like you
not that,
did, right?
yes,
And so I
not at
think
all.
that the childhood piece is really important, which I have found so special that I was able to give that to my children now in
Mhm.
the past year and a half, because they would have never understood what it means to be Swiss, live in Switzerland, engage with all the different cultures within Europe. And I find that invaluable,
What a
and I don't
gift.
think my kids would have had the same relationship to their country had they not had this experience,
Mhm.
because, yeah, they're still relatively removed living here and just having me speak to them or going to visit every year, I mean, I didn't think was enough. And to
Yes.
me, that was important, sort of really knowing, where you
Mhm.
come from.
Yes. So here's the thing about being rooted somewhere else. Can you really ever belong anywhere? And I'll tell you a little bit about my own experience. I feel like growing up in Venezuela, I was always just a little bit more American than the rest. I remember one time walking like downtown and somebody being like, la gringa, the American one. I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, you can't be from here. It's, how you look, even how you talk, and just some of your family's culture. And then now I live in the US and I find myself just not entirely American. I'm not. I'm so much of a Venezuelan. And I find that in both places, there's a sense of like, I don't fully belong. Is that something that you have ever felt or sensed from your experience talking to friends or clients?
Absolutely. I have always felt 50-50. And it's this weird feeling because every time I'm in Switzerland, there's parts of me that I really miss parts of America. Like, and I felt this in this year and a half too. There are certain aspects of this culture that I really love. And I always find myself torn, no matter where I am. When I'm
Yes.
here, I long for certain things, of Switzerland or European upbringing. And I've especially noticed that in the things going back now, because I think that's what drew me there in the first place to show my kids what it's like to go to school there. And I think, especially coming from a city, having much more freedom as a child. And I think part of, especially in Europe, one of the beautiful things I find is that children are taught to be more responsible and use more thinking at a very early age, which
Wow.
is very different to the culture in America.
Okay.
And I'm talking
Is that
about,
in schooling or in practical day life?
like an example would be playgrounds.
Okay.
Playgrounds it would never be acceptable to have a playground as they do there, because there would be, fear of accidents or lawsuits or,
Wow.
and kids are, you have these towers that they climb up and there's maybe no railing there. And kids have to think. They have to think to be responsible. They walk to school, at the age of 5 alone, come home. It's that kind of thing that I think is a big difference that sort of drew me back to Switzerland and sort of like what I don't find is the case here.
Yes.
But yeah, I feel very, very back and forth. And, where do I belong? I think that one of the things is with the language. I find if you're raised in two cultures, I find it's hard to be perfect in both languages in terms
Yes.
of writing, speaking. Like, you're a little bit of a mix. And I've
Very
always
much.
felt I've been a little bit of a mix.
I have I always say Spanglish should become an official language, and that would make so many people really happy.
Yeah.
An official language that incorporates the best of English and the best of Spanish.
I don't know how it would be
I feel
in
like
Swiss.
in Miami we're close to getting there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I wanted to tell you something that's happening to me. I am noticing now that my kids are a little older that I'm having some issues with the amount of parent involvement that is needed in schools and with celebration of certain festivities, if you will. So I grew up in Venezuela, like I said, where like a few relatively American people would celebrate Halloween, maybe, and Valentine's Day was non-existent. And now I find that every time there's a holiday, or there is a holiday every single month that requires a t-shirt, a baking activity,
Which is everything done by the
everything.
parents.
Everything is done by the parents. And I have found myself being a Grinch, which I hate because in general, I like celebrations. And, again, going back to this idea of belonging, I want my kids to belong and participate. I'm not going to, like, out of principle say, because this is not how I grew up, you are not getting this. At the same time, I'm wondering, like, is there room for this to feel a little bit more I feel like there's so much pressure from the culture to do these things.
You get
to
sucked into it
consume.
as
You
a
get very
parent.
sucked into it.
Because if you don't
and
do
I'm
it,
finding myself resisting it, but also not being able to because I'm looking out for them.
yeah, I 100% agree. And that I always struggled with, because also my kids went to a public school system. I think in private schools it may be a little bit different, but I think in general, like the parents' involvement in the children's schooling is so big. And I remember, I'll never forget when I was doing this Thanksgiving project, like this turkey, like you had to like make this big turkey, and it was all complex with this cutting out. My son couldn't even use this, a pair of scissors yet. And I just found that so, it's like, what is the point of this?
Yes.
I'm doing the project, he's there, but he's not really doing it. And it's not really encouraging kids, what I was saying before,
to think for themselves,
to think and do things that they can do or
Yes.
figure it out. And here you're doing this, and then you go to school and all these parents come with these like massive projects that like, of
Yes.
course their child didn't do. It was, mostly done by the parents.
Yes.
And to me, that made me question, like, what are we teaching our children here? What are they really learning from this?
And, when I say this, I'm thinking, well, were my parents not involved? And I think my parents were totally involved in my life, just not in school. It's almost like separation of church and state. The school does what it needs to do, and the parents do what they need to do. Because they were very involved and present in my overall education, but you can kind of like delegate to the school to do what they're meant to.
Yeah.
And
I can tell you, in the school in Switzerland, I have absolutely no involvement. Everything is done by the kids, and the parents are really not involved in projects, and I just find that so
liberating.
Yes. And good for the children. So, I think those are differences.
Well, because also I think the quality of the time you spend with your kid is different if you are having fun or teaching them manners at the table or something than if you're being like their homework helper.
Yeah.
I talk to so many clients whose relationship with their children is really taxed by having to do homework together.
It's stressful for the,
it is
and
stressful
I think it's
for the children and for the parents.
Well,
and so
especially
it's time that you're spending together, but is it the best way?
Well, and then I think what happens is, for those who can, have tutors come in, and then you have tutors do homework with the children. But I think it really sets up the parent, for, I don't know, stress, tension with the children, and it just like becomes this very parent focused or child focused relationship. Yeah, parenting, where I don't know if that's the best.
Let's change the system. No, but that is something interesting to think about. There is a culture that you're living in. How much freedom can you have to do things just a little different? Because again, I think that idea of belonging to me is very important. How do you adapt to be able to belong and to appreciate all the wonderful things that this country has to give to you, or whatever country you're living in, while at the same time sticking to like the principles and the values of, where you come from or how you understand things to work for you?
I think that's where the self comes in,
Yes.
And it is really focusing on what's important to you as a parent, and, living that. And I think principles, values, all of those things are important. They really come into play about like, what are your principles and how are you going to live that without caring too much what everybody else thinks,
Right.
Society, the school. It's a challenge, but I do think it's possible.
I agree. I think it requires getting very clear and giving yourself the freedom to do differently. Because I do find that if you just try and immerse yourself fully and do what everyone else is doing, you will lose that diversity, really, that comes
become
from
part
you.
of the system, and you lose self and you lose what's important to you, right? I think it's possible, absolutely, but I think it takes a lot. I think it takes a lot of clarity, becoming clear and like, what is important to me, and how do I stay focused on what I want and what I want to, instill in my children,
Yes.
or and not letting the noise get to you too much.
As we're talking about this, it feels a little bit like it's like swimming against the current.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I like to think of it this way, but I would say it definitely requires some effort.
I think it requires a lot of effort.
Yes.
But I think that's with anything. I think that's with any change you want to make in your relationships. It takes a lot of effort and work, and I think focus on self. And
I agree. And, this is making me think a little bit about the first question that I had for the takeaway for today's episode, which is kind of like how much of your culture is, say, your country of origin or where you live, and how much of your culture is your family's culture. Because one thing I've noticed is that culture isn't just determined, I guess, by the country where you're living. There's maybe a religious element to it. But then I also find that like families themselves have their own little personalities or cultures and values that make them very unique. Sometimes I find that me feeling like I belong or don't belong is more a product of like the tendencies in my family than the actual country that I come from. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think it's interesting to think of culture in terms of like what percentage is the country where I come from, what percentage is the country where I live now, and what percentage is maybe just like my family's way of thinking and my own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part.
Yeah.
I think our family influences us a lot, and I think it's a little bit of everything, right? It's like what shapes you as, what are those influences that shape you as a person, as a parent? And I think it's a mix of, the culture that you're living in, the culture you come from, and then your own families.
I'm laughing because I'm obviously not Swiss, but my family's culture has incorporated or assimilated so much of Switzerland because I guess we've gone there enough times that like in my house, it's common to have like Rösti and, Sprungli chocolates. And I had a Swiss person come to my house once, you know her, she's your sister. And she went into my pantry and she's like, what is this? Why do you have so many Swiss things in here? And I said, well, it's hard to explain, but it is to some degree part of my culture, even though I am certainly not.
Absolutely. But I think that is also, you spend time there, you go there, you visit, you get to know the culture. So it becomes part of you. Yes. And I think that can be with any culture, yeah. So I think, should we get to some of our questions or takeaways from today's episode? Okay. One of them that I have is, what cultural influences have shaped how you parent, and what are 2 influences you appreciate, and what are 2 influences you don't like but find hard to change? And I think we sort of touched on that before on, what are things that you're up against that maybe, if you're swimming against the current, what are those things that you either want to change, and how would you go about it? And what are the things that you appreciate?
I love that because I think it's such a good exercise to understand what have we inherited, and then from those things we have inherited or patterns, like are there some that we want to keep, and are there some that maybe we want to make different? So I like that question. I'll think about it more. For me, I was wondering about what does it take to belong somewhere if you're multicultural and live outside of the country where you were raised? So, what are the efforts that need to take place to really adapt and find a sense of belonging? And is it even possible to really ever feel full somewhere?
I was just thinking about the connection with family and relatives. And I think that is really important, is staying connected to your family and your relatives, especially because I think in today's world, we live so spread out.
Yes.
And, you have family in Venezuela, I have family in Switzerland, and I have family here. And I think that contact is important in just maintaining that connection to culture and to language. Yes. And no matter where you are.
That makes me think, it's so corny, but home is where the heart is. So if you keep nourishing those like family connections and everything, you'll be at home
Yeah.
anywhere. I think
Roots,
is kind of
you
what you're
know,
saying.
and I think it's also for children because what is going to keep them in contact with, you know, their family or culture in Venezuela? And I think, you know, a lot of it has to do with the family connections, their cousins and their, you know, the things that's going to keep that going,
Yeah.
that relationship. Yeah, that's sort of what I thought of when you asked that question. Another question would be, what do you find helpful in doing or saying when you are confronted with a parenting style or advice that doesn't fit for you? And
Oh my
I mean, I was just
goodness.
thinking of the Valentine's, you know, sort of tradition
Yes.
here, you know, and how do you manage that if you're expected to do something, but it really sort of goes against what you believe in? Or
Such a good question. I mean, the first thing I thought about was about telling someone to just mind their own business, but I don't think I ever would, to be honest. I think you can listen. I think you can listen to people's demands and to people's suggestions and comments, and then take that as an invitation to consider what you want to keep doing the same or do different, and to give yourself the freedoms. Like, you know, I think it has helped, for example, me and my husband to know that we don't need to celebrate Valentine's. So we give ourselves freedom that day to not feel like he needs to get me flowers, which he did this year, and they were really nice. But there's no expectation
right.
and no
And
pressure for that to be special. And then for my kids, I decided that I wouldn't buy them like a new t-shirt or sweatshirt for school. And I told them, pick something from your closet that you feel kind of matches. So, you know, maybe it has a heart on it or it's pink or whatever. So, you know, do participate, but maybe no, I'm not going to choose to go and spend, you know, $20 a t-shirt on it.
and I think parents are the role models in that, you know,
Mhm.
if Valentine's Day was super important for you and for your husband, then I think it automatically becomes more important to the children because they see that, you know, it's celebrated, it's a big thing.
Yeah.
And I think if it's not so important, it, you know, it sort of balances out what they're getting from the school or from their friends, or, you know, in deciding if it's, you know, becomes a big thing or not for them.
That's interesting. I hope that's the case. I hadn't seen it that way. I felt like it was really important to them because of school and the
Yeah.
culture more than it is for their parents, for us.
Yeah.
But I like that. I'm going to keep thinking about that.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, the last one is like, what is the importance of language in parenting? And it's not just like the actual language that you speak, but the expressions, the tone, how you're spoken to. You know, it's funny to me, but like in Latin American countries, there's so many differences in the Spanish. And we spent summer in Venezuela. My middle went to camp, and she comes one day and she says, "Mom, someone told me te coleaste." That means cutting the line in Spanish. And I was like, okay, mission accomplished. You know, once she starts learning um, these expressions that are so native to me, it feels like there's such a point of connection, like a new layer of connection. And so I just thought that was interesting to think about the role of language.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah. I mean, same in Switzerland, you know, just in Swiss German alone, there's so many different dialects.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's High German, and that's what they learn in school. And that's actually the language my children are speaking, even though I speak Swiss German to them, but they will answer me in High German, you know, and it's
Mm-hmm.
probably going to stay like that because we're coming back to the States. But yeah, it's interesting, you know, and but I sometimes they pick up little words in Swiss German from their friends,
Okay.
you know,
And what happens to you
and
when
they'll
you hear
just
them
come
say
and say
that?
it. Yeah, yeah, and it's special because I know
It
if
is
they stayed there longer, they would actually end up speaking Swiss German.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, so yeah, I think language is just fascinating, and
it gives a lot of depth to the
yeah.
connection, it
Well, and
sounds like.
it's, you know, it allows you to connect to many other people around the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the more languages you speak, it's, I don't know, I'm very fond of languages.
Well, I think your kids are lucky to have received the past 2 years of experience abroad, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
All right.
So hopefully that will give you all some things to think about, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again.
Yes, we will. Send us your questions to our email. What is it? Info at the me and us podcast at gmail.com. And we will also take suggestions on other topics too.
Absolutely. We'd love to actually hear what are topics of interest. Please let us know.
All right.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.